Welcome back, everyone, to another edition of the Prove Me Wrong podcast. As always, I'm your host, Pete Lieb. I'm glad you're back with me again today. Great show tonight. As you can see, I'm in the studio, which can only mean one thing. We're going to do some serious rocking and rolling tonight. I've mentioned multiple times over the course of the podcast, and longtime listeners know that I am a rabid music fan. I listen to music. I have several episodes now about our favorite albums from certain bands, talk about music all the time. And believe me, we're going to in the future as well. It's just part of the show at this point. Honestly, when somebody tells me that they don't like music, that's typically a red flag for me that our relationship probably isn't going to last too long. It's got an expiration date. I'm just saying. So tonight, we're going to jump right in, and we're going to discuss the white-hot but short-lived hair metal phase of rock and roll, which began in the early 80s before reaching mainstream popularity later in the decade, and then just basically disappearing entirely in the early 90s. You know, the hair, the makeup, the outfits, the androgyny, the guitar virtuosos, and to me, most importantly, the songs, because that's really what it comes back down to. There were a lot of amazing songs that define the decade and have stood the test of time. The time frame has been popularized in print, through videos on MTV, Headbangers Ball for me, in films like Decline of the Western Civilization Part 2, The Metal Years. It's a good movie. If you haven't seen it, give that a shot. And even more recent ones like The Dirt. It was a Motley Crue biography, loosely biography pick. Hair metal is now experiencing a revival of interest and nostalgia, allowing bands like Poison and Motley Crue to tour stadiums again across the country. Well, at least until the outbreak happened. So tonight we're going to talk about the hair metal phenomenon. My guest for the discussion is Christopher Hilton, and we are going to discuss his book, The Spectacular Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of Hair Metal. And if you're watching the YouTube or the Rumble podcast or video cast, I have a picture of the book on the page right here, so you can see what it looks like. You can pick that up. Chris is an 80s glam rock enthusiast of the highest degree and a devoted fan of hair metal since his early teens in the mid-80s. He's lived and breathed the genre for more than 35 years, and he's loving every minute of it, like a lot of us do. You can find more information online at hairmetalforever.com, and you can find the books as well on amazon.com. So with that, I will say welcome, Chris, to the show. I appreciate it.
Hey, Pete, thank you so much. I'm glad to be here. Always good to talk with fellow fans of the genre, and can't wait.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I think you and I talked offline, and I have a band on the weekends myself, and we do 80s rock mostly, but then we also do a secondary band called Selfish Lover, which is an 80s hair band. You know, we dress up in full regalia. We have the wigs and just the ridiculous clothes. It looks like I'm gonna either a pirate or something. You know, the flowery blouses. But people love it, and I think it does.
I caught that clip. Is that you on vocals?
That was me. That's me. I'm the singer of the band.
It sounded really good. I've always envied those who could carry a tune. I don't have that ability myself. It sounded great.
Well, I appreciate that, but it's really taken off this year. We started it this year, and whether it's the nostalgia of it or again just the spectacle, because you with the ridiculous outfits that we wear, but people have really taken to it. So. But kick us off a little bit more on your background, if you don't mind, and what made you get involved in writing the book.
Yeah, certainly. It's basically what you said. It's nothing overly dynamic. I mean, I'm just a huge, huge fan of the genre. Mm-hmm. I've read just about everything there is to read about hair metal. And, there's many impressive individual pieces of writing out there, from something as small as a news post every day or an album review, to band interviews, all the way up through, great autobiographies. You can read them by people like Slash or Sebastian Bach or Motley Crue's The Dirt you mentioned. Mm-hmm. But aside from my innate love of the music, I always thought something was missing, something that would help the fans tie it all together, really like an interconnected narrative that truly reflects the overarching arc of the genre as an entity. Because as you mentioned in the introduction, this was a fairly unique thing. This genre of music came to reach dizzying heights of success, right? Mm-hmm. It exploded out of the gate, only to really suddenly and spectacularly implode almost overnight, and basically find itself almost extinct for the better part of a decade, only to find relevant life again at a later point. Music or not, that's quite a story in and of itself, not to mention all the spectacular songs and albums and artists along the way. So I thought, why don't we put something together that connects it all and tells it as a story like that. Honestly, it was the book I always wish someone else had written so I could enjoy reading it. I can only hope I did the fantastic subject matter justice. So I just figured, let's give it a shot. I think for better or worse, 80s hair metal is probably the only thing I'm qualified to have an expert opinion on. So there you have it.
Well, like I said before we started, I'm definitely a fan, but I'm not the super fan that you are, the expert that you are. I can't go toe to toe with you. But the term hair metal, can you kind of give us an idea of how you define when we're talking hair metal? What's your definition of that? Because I think that there are some bands that got lumped into that time frame that may have started beforehand or really weren't hair metal bands, but they kind of get lumped in there. To me, like Van Halen, to me, was not a hair band. Maybe 1984 kind of towed the line with David's outfits, but once Sammy started, they didn't even try to look like a hair band. Honestly, 5150 and on, they didn't even try. So what is your, how do you define the term hair band? And then, just kind of go from there.
Well, it's a polarizing term for any
Yeah.
fans of the genre or even fans of music sometimes. Interestingly enough, the very first sentence in the very first chapter of their book starts off and it says, I have a confession to make. I hate the term hair metal. So, why in the world would I use it as the title of the book and mention it if I hate it?
Right.
And it requires a little backstory to your point. I mean, most people are the casual fan is probably surprised to learn that the term hair metal wasn't even invented until years after the genre's heyday. I mean, nobody used the word hair metal in 1988 or
Right.
even 1990 for that matter. And during the peak of the genre, it was all, believe it or not, it was called heavy metal, right? Poison
Exactly.
and Warrant or heavy metal. Hair metal was a term that was invented really after grunge. I mean, people needed a disparaging, pejorative term, and hair metal was implying that the genre wasn't credible, or it wasn't about the music, that it was all about hair and style, and really style, no substance. And of course, the bands hated this, and who
Right.
could blame them? And fans grew to hate it because it just wasn't true for the most part. I mean, certainly there were some bands that leaned in that direction, but those were the exceptions. You mentioned guitar virtuosos. These were mostly highly skilled musicians.
Absolutely.
And the music was much harder to play and sing than grunge. Take Poison's guitarist, C.C. DeVille, a signature goofball, right? A hair metal poster boy. He was classically trained under the great Acek Perlman or bands like Winger. These are classically trained musicians. And even a song like 17 by Winger, if you listen to the undercurrents and the architecture of the song, that's a fairly complicated piece of music, right? You're not just going to pick up a guitar and play that.
Reb Beach blew me away. Reb Beach was the guitar. It blew me away the first time I heard that. I couldn't believe how many notes you could put into an 8 count. I mean, it was an absolutely amazing 17, just to your point, absolutely amazing guitar solo. And yes, grunge effectively killed the guitar solo. I don't know that we have them since, honestly. I mean, since 93, I don't know that we have a guitar solo anymore. And to your point, C.C. DeVille, Reb Beach, Warren DeMartini from Rat, some of these guys were just an amazing guitar players. Not even talking Randy Rhoads. He passed right before it really kind of got going. But every song was just outdoing each other in terms of the craft of these musicians. And grunge was really the antithesis of that. They could barely play their instruments in some cases. It felt like to me. So I never. It was just terrible. But so to basically just put them down is really annoying to me. But so what level of
used as a negative term?
Yeah.
It's a terrible thing. But I mean, like it or not, it has evolved to be the universal identifier of this kind of music, right? I mean, it's clear to your audience. When I thought about the title of the book, I could have used the term glam metal because that's almost interchangeable. Although glam, that's not so different from hair metal. Glam, glamour, it's speaking to style over substance. But you talk about glam metal and people are confused, right? Maybe it's a book about David Bowie or Alice Cooper or the New York Dolls.
Exactly, yeah.
You could have called it heavy metal, but then people are expecting something like Metallica or Megadeth or Testament. Or maybe I just should have used hard rock or 80s hard rock, but that could be a million bands that weren't in the scope, right? So even though I cringe at the thought of including the term in the book's title, for all these legitimate reasons that you shouldn't do that if you're a fan. And, I've heard from dozens of people who won't pick up the book because it refers to their band as hair metal, right? And I get it, trust me. I completely get it. But the point is, it's clarity of topic. When someone says hair metal, you generally, on average, for better or worse, you know what you're getting, right? You're getting Motley Crue, Poison, Guns N' Roses, Skid Row, Warrant, Rat, Whitesnake, Bon Jovi, you name it.
Yeah.
Just like with Hair Nation on XM Radio. But the other thing I think is the term is, over the years, has evolved to be less of a derogative term and more of a happily nostalgic term for many, right? Now, certainly not all. Some of the fans, particularly the hardcore fans, they'll go to their grave saying, I hate this word, and I might join them on any given day.
Mm-hmm.
The bands, are not going to adhere to this. You say the word hair metal to Sebastian Bach or Nikki Sixx, and they'll probably try and rip your stomach out through your throat. And I get it, right? So
yeah.
Not trying to offend our heroes or anything, but at the end of the day, it was for clarity and really for nostalgia. But when you talk about which bands were hair metal, which ones weren't, you talked about Van Halen. I think that's a great discussion. And how many times has it been had by how many enthusiastic fans? I think in the book, I really talk about it split into 4 segments. You have the very first tier, which is for the ultra casual fan, who basically would say every band with long hair in the 80s was hair metal. All of them. And then you get a second group that is slightly more particular. Let's say, okay, it's every band, but like the super heavy thrash, heavy metal bands, the Slayers, the Megadeths, the Metallicas. The third group gets a little more restrictive in the taxonomy. To your point, Van Halen, Aerosmith, right? They will tell you that, hey, these are 70s based bands. They're not hair metal. Even though you could argue Van Halen had the blueprint for hair metal very early on, or certainly certain segments of it. Things Aerosmith did with their Permanent Vacation album, their comeback album, for lack of a better term, was very hair metal oriented. Or people will throw out Guns N' Roses, right? Because Guns N' Roses they'll use words like too authentic or too real, or too, not glamorous. Although if you look at the video for Welcome to the Jungle, Axl's got some pretty high hair, high teased up hair. Or they'll throw out Def Leppard, right? And all of these have merit.
Right.
And then you get the fourth group, right? This is the really passionate fans. And I can be in this group in any given day of the week, I promise you. But we can conjure all kinds of defenses as to why any of these bands shouldn't be called hair metal. Skid Row, too heavy. Whitesnake, well, really like a late 70s and early 80s blues rock band before they morphed into something hair metalish in 1987. Or Red Beach, right? Winger, you mentioned. Really kind of a prog rock group in disguise. Faster Pussycat, LA Guns, more sleaze metal. Or they'll look at White Line and say, hey, too political, with songs like When the Children Cry or Cry for Freedom, Bang Tango, too funky, Mr. Big, too talented, Tesla, 70s rock. Again, I could go on and on and on forever. There's only a few bands that probably everyone agrees are going to get lumped under that hair metal category, for better or worse. And even these, you could find some discrepancy, but Poison, Rat, Kix, Steelheart, Firehouse, Trickster, Danger, a lot of these bands that came to quote unquote saturate the scene in the late 80s, early 90s. But I'll tell you what, if you want to have an argument or a discussion with a hair metal fan or glam metal fan, just use the term. And you're in for a spirited ride.
You just gave me a lot of information there. How did you get the research for the book? What was the process that you went through to research all this information?
Well, it's a double-edged sword, because on one hand, it's a huge book. You've seen it. It's 450 pages. I tried to make it as comprehensive as possible. At the same time, it's not the encyclopedia. If you can believe this, the first draft of this book, when I finished it, was 800 pages, right?
Wow.
Because I wanted to be entirely thorough and comprehensive, but I knew even the most hardcore fan was not going to want to read an 800-page dissertation on hair metal. So, the arduous, painful process of taking certain bands out or giving certain bands less press. And trust me, I've heard from so many people and it's good because that means they're a real fan. They're upset because their band didn't get as many pages as another band.
Right.
And that's going to happen unless you write an 800-page book. But as far as the research, I didn't want to do it from a researcher standpoint. I wanted to do it from a fan standpoint. At the same time, you have to include all the facts and all the relevant details, but what I didn't want is a cut and paste of Wikipedia, because anybody can write that book. Any researcher can write that book. So there's opinions in it, right? And I think that's fine. I love it when people have opinions that differ from mine, especially about music. What I love the most is when someone tells me their favorite album by a band is my least favorite album from that band, right? Because it makes me go back and listen to it.
Yeah.
Maybe there was something there I missed. Not always, right? I'm probably not ever going to be a huge fan of Generation Swine by Motley Crue. We'll probably come to that later. So the research process was simply, like I said, living and breathing this. every day, because God knows what's wrong with me. It was it's a chronological story. And so I got almost 3,000 hair metal, to use the term, we're going to use it throughout the discussion, CDs upstairs. And so for every year that I did, I just went and looked back through the catalog. What music was released that year. Wow. I tried to think about, I got a whole stack of old, for those that knew, or older gentlemen like us, Metal Edge and Hit Parader and Circus and Kerrang and Rip and all these magazines sitting around that I went back to get quotes from. And I've had discussions with some of these bands and talked with them through meet and greets and tried to remember as much as I could and go back and look up some quotes and get some good information. So it was research, and it didn't have to be, because like I said, for some crazy reason, all this stuff's in my head. I don't know what's wrong with me.
I mean, I have said this before in previous podcasts. I feel sorry for the kids of today that don't get to open up even when I was young, records were going out. It was really CDs, but even CD cases, you could open up the CD case and the wrapper there, and sometimes the lyrics were there, sometimes there was artwork there. You got those magazines, and you were waiting for the magazine, the next episode to come out, or you would go to the 7-Eleven or whatever the convenience store is, and you would find one there and you would get it. Everything wasn't at your fingertips. You had to have some anticipation for things. You had to wait for things. Opening up a CD case was an event versus just downloading it. I mean, I think that so much of this stuff has gotten so impersonal now, and that was part of the joy of music when I was a kid. And I've started to kind of I have a 19-year-old and an 18-year-old. And I've been trying to get my 18-year-old daughter. She's gotten involved in vinyl, and so you see, I'm showing her, and she's looking at these album covers, and she's opening up the double albums and seeing the artwork in there. I said, "This is how my whole life was when I was a kid. It was awesome. It was just awesome like that." And I really feel bad that, if for the sake of, I don't know what it is, convenience or cost or whatever, we've lost some of the magic of. And you didn't necessarily have that much information on these people, so you kind of had to make it up, or you had to wait to get something for them. Now they're all on Instagram, they're all on Facebook. You can see everything they do every day, and the mystery's gone. But I mean, my earliest part, and I wanted to ask this question, was kind of who set the bar with the term. Again, it wasn't hair band then; it was heavy metal, like you said. I would watch it on Headbangers Ball. I mean, that's why how I'd see these out, and you don't necessarily think of hair bands that way. But to me, it was Motley Crue that set okay, here it is. And I know some people would think it was like Theater of Pain, but I always thought it was Shout at the Devil. That was where because they put that there. That was in '83, because Theater of Pain came out in '85, something like that.
Yes.
And I remember myself listening to Out of the Cellar by Rat in '84, and they already had to look down in '84, and that was one of the greatest albums of all time, in my opinion. I listened to it maybe 3 months ago, and it held up. It's held up for 40 years, however long it's been. So in your opinion, was Motley Crue kind of the setting the bar, and then from that point, everybody else followed along?
I think there were a few breadcrumbs as you look at the origins of the genre, right? I mean, certainly you could trace it back to a lot earlier than the 80s, really. If you look at what David Bowie and Kiss and Alice Cooper and Aerosmith and the New York Dolls, even others like Hanoi Rocks, or heck, maybe even Led Zeppelin were doing in the 70s, lots of the elements were there, right? But certainly when people think about the things they associate with hair metal, you skip to the early 80s when you think about the birth of this. And like we said, maybe even you look at Van Halen in the late 70s, right? They had some of these elements there as a blueprint. They had this flashy, flamboyant, charismatic frontman. Right. They had the guitar virtuoso, right? They had this loud party rock music that still had melodies, right? And that was really what hair metal was kind of trying to do. It took the aggressive nature of heavy metal and merged it with the melodic nature and the hooks of pop music, right? And there you had something new. But I think really one of the first things that launched it, Quiet Riot, the Metal Health album, was the first heavy metal album to go to #1. And it was all because of, go figure, a cover song, right? Come On, Feel the Noise, that the band didn't even want to record. They tried to sabotage that recording. You can read about that in the book. But that really opened the doors to say, hey, this genre of music can compete with the pop music that was prevalent at the time. In fact, the Police's Synchronicity album was #1 when Metal Health overthrew it, right? So that was one thing. And then certainly you're right. When you think about Motley Crue, they were something in 1981 different, What they put forth as a stage show and put down as a really aggressive guitar tone and this, ruckus-based music in their live show, that was different. And then certainly with Shout at the Devil, there's a much more commercial appeal. I mean, what they did on Shout at the Devil was really leagues beyond what their competition was doing at that time in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And you had the hit, and then of course you had Pyromania the same year, 1983, and now you're all over MTV, right? And you're all over the radio, things like a Photograph, and then to your point, 84 you had Rat, right? So Rat was hair metal in 1984. The look, the sound, they had that crazy video for Round and Round, and it's on the televisions in everybody's living room. Certainly you didn't have to be on the Sunset Strip to know what this music was all about. Twisted Sister, of all things, had the 2 big videos on MTV, right? And then they were in people's houses. And then it built from there, right? You had Van Halen's 1984, you had Dokken, Wasp, Motley Crue's Theater of Pain, with Smoking in the Boys' Room and Home Sweet Home. Again, all over MTV.
Right.
And then, of course, it finally broke really big with Slippery When Wet. Now, that was it in 1986. And then for the next 5 years, this was a dominant commercial and cultural force.
I agree with you with Van Halen. And honestly, I do think if Van Halen had come out when MTV already existed, that it might have been even more so. They may have truly been the first hair band. Because Eddie was the guitarist that every other guitarist tried to be.
Absolutely.
David Lee was the frontman that every frontman that has ever come ever since has tried to be.
Yep.
And MTV just didn't exist at that point. So I do think that some of what Motley Crue and Rat and all those, what they did was influenced by the fact that they had a platform on television that would show you 24 hours a day. And so a lot of bands, a lot of artists were made and broke by how much they got played on MTV. And again, you saw Van Halen do it with 1984. And coincidentally, you just mentioned those were the first 2 albums I ever bought. I went to a place called Magnolia Thunderpussy in Columbus, Ohio. That was the name of the record store. And I bought 1984 and I bought Pyromania. And those were the first 2, and I was 12 years old. And so, a lot of people will say, "Oh, I bought Menudo. It was my first." No, I bought Pyromania and Van Halen. But at the same time, Kiss, you saw Kiss all over MTV at that same time with "Lick It Up," and to this day, "Lick It Up" is probably my favorite Kiss album. And I don't know if it's just because of nostalgia, but that's another album I listened to, 3 or 4 months ago, and every song held up for me. Every song was still incredible. But I personally think that the impact of MTV was enormous on it, enormous on everything, enormous on the good and the bad, because it kept pushing them towards more and more just outrageous looks. So, do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. You can't understate the topic of MTV being able to make or break a band at that time period, right? If you had a hit video on MTV, there you go. And if you couldn't get on, you didn't have anything. And you're right. MTV, in the absence of the internet age, and people find it hard to believe, but there was no internet during that time.
That's right.
So to your point, if you wanted to know about these bands, they might come to your hometown once a year if you're lucky, or you might get to see a picture of them in a magazine every 30 days. So once you had MTV, this was the primary vehicle for exposure. And like it or not, to be on MTV, you had to be pretty, right? So it fostered a lot of this look, and the 80s itself, right? We know this, those of us who were there, the 80s were about one thing and one thing only: excess.
That's right.
Not only in music, but also in, socioeconomics and culture. That was what it was about: bigger, more, bigger, and then more again. And so music reflected this, and it just got, at some point when we'll eventually talk about, what caused it to collapse, but at some point you couldn't play guitar any faster, right? You couldn't party any harder, so it kind of inherently, it wasn't necessarily built to last. But yeah, if you could get a video on MTV in particular, I'm sure we'll come to it, if you could get a power ballad on MTV, there you go. You pretty much had a platinum record.
Yeah, I think that they had just as much blame and credit for making it and breaking it all at the same time. Because you kept having to push farther and farther and farther into the obscene or the ridiculous, and eventually, you have Nelson out there. Nelson talking about love and affection, but some of the bands. Let me go back real quick though. Some bands, and you mentioned when you were talking about your 4 types of people. some bands successfully made that transition from 70s pop. Kiss, if you listen to Kiss's first album, I will go to my grave saying that was just a pop album. If they didn't have the makeup on and they weren't wearing those outfits, if you just listen to the songs, it sounded like a 70s pop song. I mean, they weren't overly hard. They got heavier as the decade went on, and then they recreated themselves. So, I mean, there are some bands that successfully made that transition from what they were in the 70s to hair bands. And again, Kiss, Whitesnake, Scorpions, to me, made that transition. Ozzy Osbourne moved himself around. What band outside of the 80s that wasn't necessarily formed there would you consider to have made the best transition? To me, it's Kiss. I don't know what your thought is about that. I mean, they went from what they were from the time they took the makeup off till 89 when they're doing smashes, thrashes, and hits. They fully bought in to the culture. What do you think?
I mean, there's a lot of truth to that. I think you can point out a lot of bands from the early 80s or even in the 70s that, for lack of a better term, jumped on the hair metal type of bandwagon, right? And steered their music to that type of sound. And, who could blame them, right? I mean, these are largely integrity-based musicians, but at the same time, they're trying to make a living, right?
Right.
And you're going to steer yourself towards something that sells. Kiss is a great example. You talk about Lick It Up, that was 1983, I think.
Yes.
That doesn't sound too much different than The Down Boys by Warren. When they moved on to Heaven's on Fire for Animalize, or Tears Are Falling, or almost the whole Crazy Crazy Nights album, or my favorite Kiss album, which is Hot in the Shade. This was built to sound like Whitesnake, Bon Jovi, Rat, Motley Crue, and for the most part, it did. There wasn't too many discerning things that made it all that different.
That alone, people give Kiss a lot of hassle, but that alone, that chameleon ability to go from where they were, again, to me, that first album was almost a pop album. Then they got a little bit heavier. Then they realized, wait a minute, this isn't selling anymore. Tales from the Elder, whatever the hell that was. Let's make a disco. And suddenly they're a disco band for 6 months. And then they realize, wow, we had some success doing this. And then they realize that's no longer cool. What can we do now? Let's take the makeup off and go full on, 80s hair band, heavy metal. That is just, a lot of bands just died. A lot of bands just died when they got to that point. They were just not there anymore. And they kept churning it out. Whitesnake kept churning it out, kept going. Suddenly they get the Whitesnake album, and then the one after Slip of the Tongue after that. Is that what it's called, right? Slip of the Tongue?
That's right.
Which I'll say right now, I preferred Slip of the Tongue to the Whitesnake album. I thought Steve Vai, again, when you're talking about virtuosos, Steve Vai on that album was amazing. And I keep trying to tell people that because they all think I'm crazy because it doesn't have Still of the Night or what's the other one? The one
Here I Go Again.
Here I Go Again. It doesn't have those two on it, so it can't be good. But
well, it's interesting. You mentioned that. I personally like the Slip of the Tongue album. You're right. It is much maligned, right? The classic Whitesnake fan says, hey, they were a blues-based 70s band.
Exactly.
And then they looked down on the 1987 album because it was, quote-unquote, full-blown hair metal. And then they further looked down on Slip of the Tongue because it was, how high can I sing and how much excess and reverb can I get in this thing? And, they might not know. I mean, that album, Steve Vai had no writing on that album other than to embellish the guitar solos.
Yes.
But I've heard all the rough demos, and a lot of people have, of that album when Adrian was playing on them, Adrian Vandenberg, who did the 1987 album. And, some people say Steve Vai came in and he ruined the record, right? Because now it's no longer a blues record. It's some massive, crazy hair metal thing. I personally very much appreciate what he did for it. He took those songs from some fairly cookie cutter blues rock templates and really made them, blast out of your speakers and charge out. So I'm a fan of it too, but I think we're in the minority in terms of liking Slip of the Tongue.
If you put headphones on, and listen to that song, there's not one bit of empty space. There really isn't. Any time that Coverdale is not singing, there is some amazing little riff or little squeal or something that, The Deeper the Love, Now You're Gone, those two songs, I keep hearing those. And he put these little noises in there, and there's never a blank space. I was like, oh my God, I mean, it's just a constant barrage to your senses when you listen to it. Okay, I mean, I guess there's always going to be people who say this band sold out there, this band sold out there, people don't like Slave to the Grind because it wasn't, Skid Row. Slave to the Grind was incredible. That was an incredible album.
One of my top 5 favorite albums.
Yes.
Absolutely.
But because it was such a departure from 18 in Life, when Monkey Business and Slave to the Grind comes just crushing in on you, well, that's not 18 in Life. So what? It was awesome. It was amazing. And that was honestly, I thought, where they were trying to, that was more who they were. And again, you were trying to talk about Sebastian Bach pulling your guts out if you call him hair metal. Sometimes you have to do what you have to do to break in, and then you get to do what you want to do the second time around. And that's what that seemed like to me. They got to do what they want to do.
That was really where they were. That was not contrived or marketed. That was what they wanted to do. That, in fact, their record company wanted them to go the opposite way. They wanted nothing more than another "I'll Remember You" and another 18 in Life.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't deliver that, right? They delivered 3 ballads, but these were not sugary power ballads of the 80s, right? These were dark, heavy ballads. That record was strange in the fact that everything that gave them success, they went in another direction, right? And that wasn't the popular thing to do at the time. So hats off to them, because I think it was what was in their hearts. The record debuted at number 1. Obviously, it didn't have the sales of the debut album because it was missing those big radio-friendly songs.
Right.
But Slave to the Grind, for me, if I had to give you my top 5 albums in the genre, it's going to be in that list.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there's not a skippable song on it. By the time you get done, you feel like you got run over by a truck in a good way, right? But it's a crushing album. Sebastian Bach, in his day, probably had almost no equal in terms of his ability to deliver this kind of music vocally. Just an amazing performance.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, it was so heavy. It was, again, the first time I heard it, I came out in 91. I was, I think, a junior or senior in high school. And the first time I heard that, I think it was it Slave to the Grind? What was the first? Monkey Business, the first song. And that came in, and I was like, oh my God. Is that really, is that really Skid Row? I couldn't believe it. It was so impressive. But, okay. So you mentioned, Slippery When Wet. That is the point where we had the breakthrough, right? So from 86 to about 91, all of a sudden on the Billboard charts, right, you're seeing Warrant, you're seeing Poison, you're seeing Bon Jovi, you're seeing Skid Row, you see even some Motley Crue was up there as well, but you're starting to see what we consider hair bands right up next to the Police were gone by then, but U2 and some of those other more mainstream kind of bands. So that was their heyday. So was it just Slippery When Wet? Did Bon Jovi just come in and just kick the door in?
I mean, there were certainly the albums we talked about before that. I mean, Pyromania sold 10 million copies.
True.
But nothing ushered in the era like Slippery When Wet, as far as just wide scale appeal to everyone, the females, the males, you name it, the rockers, the pop rockers. Everybody had 12 million copies for Slippery When Wet, right? It had this huge power ballad. As soon as Motley Crue said, hey, this could be a viable template, after Home Sweet Home, you couldn't make a hair metal album without having at least one power ballad, right? You couldn't do it. So they had Wanted Dead or Alive. And then, of course, if you think back now, it's 40 years later. But if you think about the most endearing songs of the genre for the mass public, it's usually always going to be Living on a Prayer is going to be on that list, right? So just some huge songs on that record. And of course, the look of Bon Jovi, right? I mean, let's face it, John had this look that, girls could not turn down. God bless him. But everything really kicked the door in there. Poison had their debut record, which wasn't a huge seller, but Cinderella was out. You had Sammy Hagar come to Van Halen, and they had more commercial success than they ever had, because of course they had the synth keyboard laden ballad or pop ballad to launch it off. And then in 1987, it just built on itself. You had Hysteria, 25 million copies. Appetite for Destruction, 30 million copies worldwide, even though both those records took about a year to hit. You had this big Whitesnake album we were talking about. Motley Crue had somehow managed to not kill themselves, and had, the Girls album. Aerosmith had finally made it back to the top of the mountain, probably more popular than they had ever been, because they had some outside writers come in and perfect this aggressive music meets pop, and they had the Ragdoll and Dude Looks Like Lady, and of course Angel, right? You got to have the power ballad. Mm-hmm. And then, like you said, people would not believe us now. But in 1988, you could look at the Billboard chart, and there was Open Up and Say Ah, and there was New Jersey, and there was OU 812. I mean, this is what the mass America was listening to. People would not believe us. And then it got even bigger until it didn't. And Skid Row, Warren came along. You had Dr. Feelgood, Motley Crue's Commercial Apex.
Right.
And then, of course, you had everything that was symbolic of the genre. You had Cherry Pie. You had tons of other bands come out. You had Slaughter, Trickster, Firehouse. You mentioned Nelson.
Bonham, Stryper.
Yeah, right. You name it, right?
Bullet Boys.
Tons of releases, right? To your point, Ozzy Osbourne. It was 1991, so Ozzy Osbourne puts out a hair metal sounding album, right? No More Tears was, it's not traditional hair metal by any means, but it was more hair metal than anything he had done prior to that.
Well, and Ultimate Sin before that even. Ultimate Sin, mid 80s, I was a huge Ozzy fan, and so yeah, Ultimate Sin in the 80s is when he really got that pop. That before that he was still, the earlier albums were still what I would have considered more just heavy metal, hard rock. But he bit into it. Yeah, No More Tears, that was everywhere when I was a junior in high school. Everywhere, you couldn't get away from it. It was just pumping out of every radio in the high school as we drove past. But so who would you consider to be kind of the more underrated, or in your opinion, the most underrated band of that time frame?
This comes down to personal preference.
Sure. Yeah. But you're the expert. I'm not. So.
Well, I don't know. If I think about underrated bands and you think about underrated music, certainly you have to steer away from any of the platinum sellers, right?
Yes.
We'll just
right.
Out, right?
They got their credit.
They got their credit, right? I was always a big fan. When we talk about the genre becoming, and I'll dovetail here for a second, the genre becoming overly saturated. Because people like to say grunge killed hair metal, or more specifically, they'll tell you Nirvana killed hair metal.
Yeah.
And there is an element of truth to that, but it's certainly not the whole story. To your point, there's a big part of hair metal that killed itself.
Yes.
And part of that was because the genre just became so oversaturated, and there was, as much as people loved it, there's not an infinite amount of demand to meet infinite supply. Anyway, there was lots of new bands. One of the records that I always loved was a band called Heaven's Edge. I don't know if you're familiar with them.
No.
Philadelphia-based band. They put out a record in 1990, and if you listen to it, it had all the hallmarks of what should be a platinum-selling album. It didn't sound any different than the other albums. It had a great guitarist, a wonderful singer. It had the hard rock heavy songs. It had the radio-friendly mid-tempo pop song. It had the huge ballads, but it didn't sell. Right, because there was just too much out there.
Right.
So when people think about underrated albums, I always think back to that one. Britney Fox did an album in 1991 with their new singer, Bite Down Hard. I thought was excellent, probably their best one. Winger did Pull in 1993, which was different than their hair metal sounding albums, if there ever was such a thing for Winger. I thought was really underrated. Some of the albums that didn't really get to see the light of day, Bang Tango's final release, or at that time period final release, the Love After Death record in 1994. Mr. Big, I thought, was always underrated. They had the huge Be With You single, and that's what people knew, unfortunately, but the fans know the rest of their catalog. These are just amazing musicians. Enough's enough. I can't say enough about the songwriting capability of Donnie B. But they never got their due for whatever reason. So those are just a few of the names that come to mind when I think about, underrated music that people may not have given its due.
And so then, so the 1990, and as funny as it sounds, because people think that Nirvana was the first band from Seattle to actually make it, but Alice in Chains came out before that. And Facelift and Man in the Box was, again, I was still a junior in high school. It was all right around that same time frame, but they, well, I guess maybe they sounded a little bit more like that album, especially may have sounded a little bit more like a Slave to the Grind type album. It was a little bit heavier, a little different than what Nirvana would come out with later. But Alice in Chains was kind of the first of those Seattle bands to come through. What do you? They say that grunge killed it. Is that accurate? Do you think it is just a matter of, again, we just got too crazy. We got too many Nelsons, too many Imposters, Firehouse, things like that that were forced to do something maybe they weren't comfortable doing?
I think it's a number of different things. First of all, anyone who's been around for any time period knows that everything's cyclical. Yeah. Right. Every genre is going to come and every genre is going to go. Everything has its cycle. I think what was unique about hair metal is there was never a genre of such commercial success that was completely abandoned almost overnight. Right, you normally had smoother transitions, maybe disco, right? Disco fell out of fashion really quick, but other than disco, I mean, this was an event, and in retrospect, we say it happened overnight. That wasn't actually true, you know, for those of us who was there. It was almost overnight, but it wasn't.
Right.
You brought up Alice in Chains. I remember buying Facelift, and I heard the first song and I thought, hey, this is cool, heavy rock.
Yeah.
When I saw Van Halen that year, Alice in Chains opened for them. Can you imagine this? A grunge band opening for Van Halen? But at that time, you know, it was all rock and roll. We didn't know we were going to have to choose, right? We didn't know the industry was going to make us choose and present these things as such polar opposites. But I think hair metal, in addition to it saturating itself, like you said, it might not have been built to last, right? Again, at some point, you can only do so much in terms of this excess. You know, and the bands themselves, they started to burn out and it started to become saturated, but maybe grunge was in the right place at the right time, I think is what it is. You know, hair metal was probably going to go away either way. It might have been a smoother transition, but when grunge hit and avenues like MTV decided, hey, there's not going to be two things here. It's going to be all grunge and nothing. And they completely abandoned it. I mean, that cut off the commercial pipeline. You know, I think you mentioned Trickster there. Do you remember the Dial MTV show? So where people would call in for the #1 video.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, right. So Trickster actually had 3 consecutive #1 videos, right? And the last of them, Surrender, was #1 for 2 weeks. And all of a sudden, this was right about that time, 1991, 1992, and MTV said, no, we're abolishing all of this, right? And it's going to be 100% grunge. And all of a sudden, Dial MTV was taken away. And, you know, not only were they not #1 anymore, but there was never a Trickster song played on MTV again at all, ever, right? That was the last #1 video on Dial MTV. But it was more of the culture too, right? We talked about the 80s was all about excess, right? It was all about good times and better times and economic growth. Grunge was more connected, I think, to a generation that was experiencing a distinctly different political and socioeconomic climate. As the 80s came to a close, times were economically shifting towards something more grim, more somber. You know, there had to be a crash to accompany this high.
Yeah.
And kids just couldn't relate to this anymore, right? Suddenly there was an entire generation of kids who couldn't relate to having nothing but a good time with Poison. You know, they didn't feel that way. And while they might have even appreciated this huge spectacle on stage for what it was, they couldn't relate to it, right? That wasn't them. But if a guy stands on stage dressed like them, and maybe he has the same guitar capabilities as them, and maybe you know, he rolled out of, not to disparage the talents of grunge bands, because I don't want to do that,
right?
But they could relate to this.
Yeah.
Right? This is something that, and again, you know, if they had feelings of angst or depression, we always associate grunge with these gloomy things. And again, I don't mean to slag on grunge all the time, but it's in my nature, so I can't help it.
Well, you went from you know, the guitar solos are gone. You went from the joy, you know, the joy is gone. You went from uplifting music about drugs and sex to depressing music about drugs and death. I mean, that's really what it came to.
But it was embraced, right? I mean, that's what the younger generation wanted to embrace.
Yeah.
They didn't want to embrace this perceived silliness that they saw on stage, right? They just weren't in that headset. I mean, for better or worse, when Nirvana's Smell Like Teen Spirit came out, I think it was late August of 1991, a seismic shift occurred, right? That had reverberations forever into the future. You know, there was just no going back to some extent. Like I said, the industry had a lot to do with it.
Oh, yeah.
You know, there's this famous story you may have heard. You know, the hair bands struggled as they moved into the 90s, and a lot of them tried to adapt, you know, for better or worse, and change their style. Most just collapsed and disintegrated when the money wasn't there and the tours weren't there. But there was a point, I think it was around 1996, Warrant was playing different style of music then. You've heard some of these albums, perhaps Ultraphobic and Belly to Belly.
Yeah.
And they wrote a new song, and they had their manager submit it to a record company without their name on it, right? And so the manager submitted it, and the record company heard it, and they said, oh my gosh, this is amazing. We love this. Who are these guys? We got to get them in the studio right away, record an album. We got to market them. They're going to be the next biggest thing. This sounds terrific. And the manager says, I just want to let you know, this is actually Warrant. And, you know, the record company kind of squinted the cherry pie guys.
Right.
And they said, nope, we don't want anything to do with it. Get this out of our face. Right. And that's what it was. I mean, if you were an 80s based rock band in the mid 90s, you had almost no chance.
You were the Bee Gees, right? You were the Bee Gees of the 70s.
Right. Yeah. It's a shame. And, you know, a lot of the bands tried to adapt their style, which I don't know that it served them really. You think about some of those albums in the 90s, the different kind of sounding albums. Poison made a blues album, right? Effectively, with a new guitarist. David Lee Roth made a solo album called Your Filthy Little Mouth, right? Which had some country stuff on it. Motley Crue made the self-titled Motley Crue album, which I love, by the way, but of course sounded nothing like Dr. Feelgood. Even the third tier, as they say, bands, Danger Danger, lost their singer and put out an album, very alternative, grungy sounding, called Dawn. We talked about the Warrant albums. LA Guns did an album that sounded more like Pantera than LA Guns. And what I think some of these musicians, if it was in their hearts and they were influenced by different styles and they really wanted to move that way, because that's where they were, you got to hats off to them, right? You got to do what's in your heart. But the ones that made the change, to try and stay relevant, you have to think, and this isn't just the benefit of hindsight, how in the world could they have thought this was going to work, right? I mean, let's say Warrant had put out the greatest sounding alternative grunge album in history. The people who liked grunge weren't going to give it a listen because it had the name Warrant on it. And Warrant's fan base from the original days, generally those people didn't like grunge, right? So who were they satisfying? They were serving no master. At least if you stick to your guns, you can continue to service the small amount of fans you have left. And maybe it was ego that said they could change and still be relevant, or maybe the A&R man said you could do it, or the marketing managers.
Or it could just be the feeling of being on stage and seeing, 40,000 people cheering your name and just wanting that. I mean, that's
sure, right?
That's as big as any adrenochrome I could think of, right? Just being on stage and just seeing that and just wanting that and needing that. And honestly, they probably thought they still had a level playing field. And you've just mentioned how unlevel it was at that point. Just mentioning the name Warrant, you no longer were invited to the party. You were gone. It's suddenly like you suddenly can't write songs anymore. You suddenly can't sing anymore. You can't play good music anymore. And I've always, that's always something that's kind of stuck in my throat, because you talking about Def Leppard. Def Leppard's made albums, the last one was like Adrenalize is the last one they really was a commercial hit. They've made like seven or eight more albums since then, but you don't play them on the radio. And how do people hear them if you don't play them on the radio? And then you've gotten to this formulaic radio airplay now, because it used to be, again, you could hear Lionel Richie right next to Motley Crue, right next to Rick Springfield, right next to Kim Carnes, all on the radio, all at the same time. And it was just amazing. So you had such a good wide range of different songs you could hear. You don't get that anymore. Now everything is, hell, a lot of them don't even have DJs anymore, let alone DJs with the ability to actually flip the record and say, I'm going to play the other side, or I heard this song last night and it rocked. I'm going to play this song, independently. Everything is structured and computerized and metered out, and there's no originality anymore. You can't tell me Def Leppard hasn't made a good song since 1990. You can't tell me that. If you listen
I wouldn't dream of it.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly, right?
Most people, their most maligned album, which was 1996's Slang, I loved that album.
Yeah.
And did it sound like Hysteria and Adrenalize? Absolutely not. I think it's a terrific
That's right.
set of songwriting and performances, and I love it for what it is. I don't try and make it Hysteria, but, hang on, I'm not going to try and force it on another fan that only wants to hear Hysteria. I mean, to each his own. But that's an amazing record. And you're right, they've had several great, the self-titled album they did a few years ago, it's probably the best thing they've released since Adrenalize. There were some fantastic pieces of music on that record.
But it's just the unfortunate side effect of, again, once you're no longer in favor, once you're not, the pretty girl at the party, and they kick you out, and that's it. And now you can either go, work, I don't know, work at a bar somewhere, bartend, or you can keep trying to grind out songs. And unfortunately, then you go on these tours and little nightclubs, and you're Warrant. I went to, this was probably late 90s. It was before Janie passed. So, they were opening. It was Quiet Riot. It was Quiet Riot, Warrant, and Poison was the headliner. And Warrant got to play like 3 or 4 songs. There was a very small set. It was an outdoor arena. It was like literally you're sitting on the grass watching Warrant in front of 200 people. And I was like, oh man, that just sucks. That's just terrible. But the benefit now we can get to the rebirth of all of these bands, because if you're looking up lately, I've gone to arena concerts lately with Def Leppard, with Night Ranger, with, a lot of those, I wouldn't call Foreigner and stuff like that a hair metal, but still those type of bands. Motley Crue and Def Leppard was going to be the biggest tour of the year until it got shut down. Is it just nostalgia? Is it just people my age, mid-40s, that are finally saying, hey, you know what, you guys all suck, this music is actually pretty good, let's listen to it?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of people read the title of the book, and it's called The Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of Hair Metal, and they say, okay, I know the rise, I remember the fall,
yeah,
I'm not so sure about this rebirth thing, right? But right around, and it actually goes back a little further, right around 1999, 2000, 2001, this style of music really did have a legitimate rebirth, even if it was never going to sell, millions and millions of records again. But coming from a place where in the mid 90s, this was basically extinct,
yes,
right? The bands were done. They folded up shop. The style of music they were playing wasn't the same. The way they looked wasn't the same. The people weren't there. But, right around the turn of the century, grunge was finally gone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nu metal and rap rock were in, and granted, these weren't styles that were hair metal, but they were closer relatives than the black sheep that was grunge, right? The music possessed a sense of energy and a passion. I mean, even artists like, say Kid Rock, this guy was about excess, right? So there were some things returning. The socioeconomic climate was changing. You had the dot-com bubble, and the people were coming to an age where, you're right, nostalgia kicked in, right? These people were ready to go to a show on Friday and Saturday night and relive their youth and have nothing but a good time. Right. So touring is really where everything came back. And you mentioned the show you saw. Bands learned that they could put together these package tours.
Yeah.
Right. So you had the Rock Never Stops tour, and Poison and Cinderella would team up, or the Warrant Quiet Riot Firehouse bill, and they could draw bigger crowds. Now, unfortunately, they didn't get to play 14 songs anymore. They got to play 9 or 10 songs each. At the same time, even the industry kind of came back on board, right? Because, of course, they sniffed money around it. And, you had VH1 had the behind the music shows, again, stirring up this nostalgia. The Def Leppard VH1 Behind the Music was one of their highest rated programs.
Absolutely.
And then you had, remember the CDs, like the Monster Ballad CD? It sold 1 million copies, right? People were ready to do that. And the bands were happy to jump out. I mean, the reunions, everybody reunited. The styles of music went back. So we talked about Def Leppard. Slang didn't sound like Adrenalize, but Euphoria did.
Mm-hmm.
Motley Crue had a tough 90s in terms of being able to relate to some of their fans. The self-titled album, Generation Swine, but New Tattoo, even though I don't think that's a very good album at all, the style was rooted in, again, you had sleazy rock party music again. Bon Jovi, God bless it, the people that started it all from a large scale. Crush was the third big, It's My Life from the Crush album was the third biggest single in the world in 2000. Right, so Bon Jovi was coming back. Poison got back together with CeCe DeVille.
Yeah,
right? Everybody got back together. LA Guns came back together. Rat and Great White actually got new record deals. Right, there was all this stuff happening, and it really created a platform for which these bands could have a stable type of existence for the last 20 years.
And Rat has come back now. Rat is almost as big as ever now, just from commercial, right? That whole guy, we got a rat problem, right? And then
yes,
we literally say that in our damn show. We're like, we got a rat problem, and then all of a sudden, Round and Round kicks in. But
it's funny you mentioned that. The people talk about the book on different Facebook sites, and Rat gets a lot of press in the books, and I think it was Rat's manager that picked up the book and he put it on their Facebook site. And it was the same time that commercial was airing.
Yeah.
And that 1 week, I think I sold more books than any other week just because of that, of all the weird things,
But that just goes back to what I was saying earlier.
Yeah.
You just have to put the needle on the record and let the kids hear the song. You can't, Rat didn't, or Round and Round didn't suddenly stop being good. Lay It Down didn't stop being good. Back for More didn't stop being good. Way Cool Jr. didn't stop being good. I loved Way Cool Jr. back in the day. All those songs didn't stop being good just because they got old. Anything from Motley Crue, Theater Pain. I don't really like Motley Crue's Theater Pain, but Shout at the Devil, those type of Girls, or Dr. Feelgood especially, Kickstart My Heart. Just play them, and kids will. And I tell the story also. I was in the line, and there were these two young men, 18 years old or so, in line in front of me, and they were talking music, and I just kind of leaned in and was listening to them talk. And the one was telling the other, "Oh man, I just found this awesome band. You would love it. You got to listen to them. It's called what was it called? Oh, it's right. It's Black Crows. I was like, and I just started laughing because they were just discovered Black Crowes, the Southern Companion, the first Black Crowes album, and I just kind of laughed and I said, "Damn, kid, I bought that when it was new, but great. I'm super happy that you've discovered it and you can appreciate it, because you can appreciate those songs. You just have to get a chance. I mean, I think if you had put a lot of those songs in a commercial right now for Geico. Well, I mean, you even see Dreams right now, the Fleetwood Mac Dreams, just from some dude riding a skateboard on TikTok. Dreams became a #1 song again. It was #1 download. It's 50 years old. You just got to put the song on the radio or the song on some platform and let kids hear it, and it'll work. But that's just me. I'm on the soapbox. I got to jump back off of that.
No, hey, I'll jump on right with you. And I think you're right. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of it is about nostalgia.
Yeah.
And the sad thing for real hardcore fans like myself is, there's nothing I'd love more to hear tons of new music from a lot of these artists. But you just don't get an album. You don't have that cycle where you tour an album because the industry's different, right? There's no money to be made in albums anymore. Right. People don't buy them. You can stream, and you got Spotify, and you got illegal downloads. So, these bands are not necessarily motivated, if it's an economic type of thing, to produce new music. And even if they did, and a lot of them do want to produce new music, unfortunately, they're backed into a corner because they go out there and let's say they're lucky enough to tour. Unfortunately, I'd love nothing more to hear some new songs.
Right.
But I'm the only guy in that audience that wants to do that. And 95% of the audience wants to hear
girls.
Yeah. Remember from the 80s, yeah. Right? And the worst, words a band can say in concert is, "We're going to play a new song," right? Because everyone's going to bolt for the bathroom or the beer booth. So even if they were motivated to produce new music, knowing there's no money in it, the average fan is not going to let them play it. They don't want to hear it. They want to go relive what they knew. And I can't say I blame the average casual fan, right? I don't expect everyone to have my view on this. And so it's difficult for artists to stay, outside of the nostalgia realm. And some of them embrace it. Some of them say, "Listen, I'm a nostalgia band. It's what it is. I'm going to live it up." Others really want to get new music out there. And there is a lot of good new music out there from these bands, if you're interested and if you know where to look. The last Whitesnake album is fantastic. Flesh and Blood, right?
Yeah.
An amazing album. It's
but yeah, tough. But when you pay $80 to go see the tour, yeah, you want to hear the hits. You're
especially because it's a package tour, right? I mean, if these bands could play 17 songs, they might be able to sneak a couple in. But you got 3 or 4 people on the bill now, and you're only going to get 10 songs. I mean, what song is Motley Crue going to drop out of the set list to play something new? Or Poison? Unfortunately, I'm a huge Poison fan, of course. Yeah. But I've recently stopped going to see Poison in concert. Not that I don't love them, because they put on a hell of a show, but it's the same 10 songs in the set list for like the last 15 years now. I mean, I can't take it anymore. But in their defense, what are they going to drop out so they can sneak in, Back to the Rocking Horse and satisfy me? They'll get crucified. Right. You got to play these 11 songs, or someone could be like, "Oh, there's jerk-offs, didn't play, Fallen Angel." It's hard.
You're absolutely right. I could probably talk for another 3 hours, but I have a couple more questions, if that's okay. We're kind of coming right up on the hour here.
Please.
So my first one is, do you personally have a favorite biography or a favorite documentary about a band? A favorite one that you had that, man, I've read this biography or this documentary and it just lit me on fire?
It's cliche, but I don't know how many times I've read The Dirt now.
Yeah.
I never get tired of reading it. I don't know what's wrong with me. I'll pick it up and I'll just open it to anywhere. And, before I know it, an hour later, I've read 30, 40 pages.
Yeah.
Same 30, 40 pages I read a few months ago. And there's tons of wonderful biographies, for people that are interested in the genre. But for me, and Motley Crue has always been one of my favorite bands. So I'll admit I'm biased in that regard. But if you're looking for, a book that really gets at the heart of what the 80s was all about, perhaps in terms of being, a real spectacle and the ups and the downs, it's hard to beat The Dirt for the dynamics. Now, the movie's out there too, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm thrilled the movie's out there, and I thought it was very entertaining. But again, for hardcore fans, the movie's tough for guys like me, because first of all, you can't tell Motley Crue's story with any degree of justice in 87 minutes.
Right.
It can't be done. And they didn't, right? I mean, they missed entire decades.
Well, they're missing an opportunity there, because I had this conversation recently too. Netflix now, they do these 8-part series. And so essentially you could tell the whole story. It'd be 8 hours versus an hour and a half. And so they could have done the dirt in 8 one-hour episodes. And it would have been amazing. You're right. They could have been really faithful to the book. They could have really given you the whole thing, and it would have been a huge hit, a huge hit.
But it would have been for me, right? And the 5% of people. They made the movie for the 80% of people, and I don't blame them.
Yeah. Well, that could be true. But I mean, Tiger King was a fucking huge success, and that thing was just garbage. I mean, people like watching a train wreck. And so if you can put that in there and show some of that train wreck that they went through as well in the 80s, I think it would definitely hold the attention span for sure. But that's just me. I think that they have something there, because we've gotten away from now where we've accepted now that you can do an 8-part series and that's it. A lot of times you do it 8 parts and you're like, oh, there's no season 2. No, this is it. We've told the story. It's 8 parts. And you don't have to try to condense 400 pages of a book into an hour because you can't do it.
You can't do it. No, you can't do it justice.
I literally had 2 pages of questions and I couldn't condense that into an hour, let alone 400 pages of actual life. So also, I ask this a lot as well. I do a lot of these rock and roll discussions where we talk about bands, talk about our favorite bands, this, that, and the other thing. And I always like to ask, we are in a cold winter right now in terms of rock and roll as well. Between a lot of the heroes that I had growing up, they're passing away, they're dying, the rock gods are going away. Do you think, in your mind, do we think, is it past? I mean, is that time frame gone completely? Do you think rock and roll can come back? Do you think the guitar solo is going to come back? I know it's not easy to do, folks. To any boy out there who's thinking about, well, how do I get chicks? Well, you pick up a guitar and you play it. First of all, you can be an ugly dude. If you know how to play a guitar well, you're going to have girlfriends, period. But it's hard. It takes a while. It takes a while to be Reb Beach or somebody like that who's just that skilled. So it's easier to get on some kind of sampler and auto-tune your voice and put something out on YouTube and get discovered that way. Do you think that the rock and roll band, the rock and roll star, is just passed, or is there still hope?
I think it's a yes and no question, right? I mean, some of the things that you and I were familiar with back in the 80s when we think about music, and you started off the discussion, talking about vinyl albums and the experience of a record and, a full set of songs, including, tracks that weren't necessarily the singles. These things aren't coming back probably, right? People are not going to go back to buying a physical form of music. I don't see that. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball any better than anyone else, but you just don't see that in our future. And to your point earlier in the discussion, it's different now. These bands can't exist as larger than life entities that, you think of as heroes that are untouchable because everything is out there on social media. There's going to be no such thing as that lifestyle anymore because there's no such thing as selling 10 million records anymore. You can make money from touring, but you're not going to live that lifestyle of excess because the dynamics around it aren't present. Some of the bands today that do know what it was like in the 80s, they'll tell you, hey, I wish I could have been in music back when music was fun, because that's not going to happen again. As far as the style, I guess everything is cyclical to a certain extent, but you mentioned it, that music has become basically disposable. It's free. It's not, it used to be that you had your band, you had their t-shirts, you went and saw them.
Right.
I don't think kids have that nowadays, right? They might have a single that they like for 2 weeks and then they forget about it and it's gone. And then whatever the next single is, bands don't get the same opportunity to develop. Like we talked about Bon Jovi. Bon Jovi had 2 albums before Slippery When Wet, right? And they grew into the band they were. Today, if you don't have a hit single right away, you're done. Right? There's no record companies aren't going to nurture bands like they did in the past.
Right.
And as far as styles of music, the overwhelming dominant styles, at least in America, and it has been this way for a while, is rap and country and whatever people call rock these days. But it's certainly not that party driven, guitar driven, happy-go-lucky type of thing for the most part. It's a little different internationally. You look up at the Nordics, right? And if you were hanging out in Sweden or Finland, the music scene, you'd think you might be on the Sunset Strip back in 1989. But we live in America, so we tend to be focused on that view. So I don't think the rock star is coming back the way we knew it. I really don't. That's not to say there won't be a style of music that I can't envision that's more akin to it, but unfortunately, some things are in the past.
Yeah, Chris, that wasn't the answer I wanted, but it is the answer I've gotten pretty much every time, and it is. I'm just waiting for that one person to say, "Hell yeah, they're coming back. It's on its way. Here it comes."
Don't get me wrong, right? People love to say they love to quote Gene Simmons, "Rock and roll is dead." I don't believe that for a second.
Yeah,
right? It's never dead because you have so many bands out there that are playing this style of music. Again, especially internationally, but there's 20 new CDs a month that are this style of music if you know where to go find them, and they're young bands. Is it going to be, are they going to be selling millions of albums, and they're going to be on MTV if there was such a thing, and are they going to be doing big global tours? Probably not. But don't worry, to give you some solace, I don't think rock and roll is ever going to die.
And if it makes anybody feel any better, we're talking 40 years later, roughly. And again, I am out playing in a band that plays all these songs. We're literally playing. We're playing Metal Health. We're playing Motley Crue. We're playing Bon Jovi. We're playing Def Leppard. We're playing Rat. We're playing Judas Priest. Twisted Sister. Everything. I don't know any band that's playing grunge. FYI. So right. you can.
And your audiences love it, don't they?
They love it.
I mean, look at the audience and look at a Steel Panther show.
Exactly.
Right? What are they doing? You'd be amazed how many 20-somethings are in the Steel Panther audience. And by the way, I have no idea how they're pulling that off. But
and they're doing original music. I mean, they're doing so it's I think that there is still a market for it if you don't mind touring and playing out 250 shows a year.
Hey, like we said, Hysteria sold 25 million copies. That's 25 million people. We're all mostly still on the planet.
Yeah.
So.
And one last thing, you're absolutely right. Gone is the day where every song on the album. I know Hysteria, I think they released 7 songs off that album as singles. And then to me, and my favorite song wasn't one of those 7, quite honestly.
Let me guess. It was Gods of War.
Gods of War was great. I actually, as silly as it sounds, I actually liked Love and Affection, the very last song
everybody says that could have been a top 3 single.
Oh, I loved it. It's something about Def Leppard anyway, just the harmonics of it and the way it sounds and the way it was produced and put together. It just hits the tickle spot. It just feels good. But that song especially was just great. But in 1984, you didn't skip one album or one song on 1984. You didn't skip one song on Out of the Cellar. You didn't skip, to me, I didn't skip one song on Lick It Up. These albums were made for the long haul. It's like, okay, we're really putting the work into every song that comes in. It's not just going to be one single at a time. We're just going to dribble it out for you so you can download it on YouTube or on iTunes. Just a completely different animal at this point. Okay. Thank you so much, Chris. Like I said, I had the structure in my mind, but then when we got talking, we just started talking, and I enjoyed it. Is there any other plans? I know you might probably been asked. I know you had a 800-page book before, so that means now you have a 400 and another 400. Do you have plans for the follow-up with that extra 400 pages?
Honestly, candidly, I do not. I will talk with anybody all day, every day, and love it about hair metal, but I think that was it for me, probably. Writing a book like that, it took pretty much 95% of my free time for almost 2 full years.
Yeah.
Not that I loved it, and I hope it turned out great. But I think there's other things I probably let go into arrears during that time. So no, I don't know. If there's ever overwhelming demand for it, I'm happy to do it.
No, absolutely. I agree 100%. Well, if you're ever in northeastern Florida, near the St. Augustine area, and you want to come and see Selfish Lover, that is the name of the hair band that we're part of. Please let me know. I'll give you a listing of events and when we're going to be and where we're going to be there. We don't do it much, just a couple times a year. We like to keep the hunger going, right? So it's an event and you wouldn't believe. We'll go in and we have two bands. We have a band called Vegas Grey, and Vegas Grey just does the normal 80s stuff. Rick Springfield, Bryan Adams, Eddie Money, the Cars, the normal 80s rock. And we'll do that for 2 hours, and the whole time I'll be announcing we're going to be here until 10 o'clock tonight. But after that we're taking off, and our friends Selfish Lover are coming in. They were big in the 80s. You may not have heard of them, but they were huge in the and we'll leave and we'll come back dressed as a different band, and people will not recognize that we are the same people. They won't. Well, they will think that it's truly a different band. We have a different banner, we have different guitars, we come out and we scream a little bit more and act a little bit more vulgar, but people think that we're different, and it's just like, oh my God, it's super fun when we do it. But yeah, if you're ever in town,
honored to be in the front row cheering you on.
That would be great. So once again, for anybody who might have forgotten it, the book is called The Spectacular Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of Hair Metal. You can find that again on hairmetalforever.com and also on amazon.com. And Chris, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you, Pete. I appreciate the opportunity to be on the show and to speak with you again. It's always wonderful to meet other fans and people who are interested in music. I hope to talk to you again sometime soon.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you very much. Have
a
good evening.
Have a good one.
Thanks. All right. That was Christopher Hilton. We talked some hair bands, the rise and fall. We basically just talked about what we like. We gave a brief history of it. It's such a deep, I know it's a 10-year time frame, but it's a lot of information to me, and we could have gotten a little bit more into it, and that's my fault, and I apologize for that. Maybe another opportunity, we'll bring you back another time, and we'll focus in on certain things. But when you had so many bands who were so good over that time frame, and you're a fan, I'm a fan. I grew up with those things, and music just triggers something in your brain. So when I hear 1984, or I hear Lick It Up, or I hear Out of the Cellar from Rat, or I hear Skid Row or Warrant, or any of the, it takes me back to where I was right then and there at that moment. And I was lucky enough as a child to have great moments around that music. And so they're not bad memories, right? So when you're hearing that music again, I think of myself being standing on the bed with a tennis racket and playing air guitar, and then jumping off the bed like you would jump off of the half stack, in a Van Halen video. It just brings you back to a happier time, to a younger time. And I think that's a lot of where this nostalgia comes from, and why people are still so excited to hear that music, because it's been proven. Music takes you right back to where you were when you first started hearing it, and so many memories and so much emotion that it comes into it. Yeah, loved it, love it. I definitely recommend it. The Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of Hair Metal, Christopher Hilton. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, what are your favorite songs? I know he was going into a lot of bands, honestly, that I've never heard of. There were a couple bands that I've never heard of, but again, I'm from Ohio, and in Ohio, I really had to rely on MTV. MTV was the lifeblood of the hair metal scene for me. If they didn't play it on MTV, I probably didn't see it. So, some of the bands that he was talking about, Wango Tango and things like that, they didn't really play those on MTV a lot. I didn't see them a lot. You had to have a certain look and be on MTV to really run the meter for a kid from Cleveland, Ohio. So, incredibly knowledgeable. What are your thoughts? I mean, what are some of the favorite bands that you had from that time frame? And how, what are your thoughts? Just how did you grow up? Did you enjoy that same type of music? Who were your favorite bands? What were your favorite albums? Do you think that kind of stuff ever comes back? Honestly, I don't think it will, but damn, I wish it would. You can leave us a comment at our Gmail account. It's provemewrongcast@gmail.com. That's our email. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram. Right there, Prove Me Wrong Podcast is just the name of the show. You can find us on either Facebook or Instagram. If you're just looking for content and ways to listen to the podcast version, the audio version, you can find us on any podcast platform that you may use. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud. We're on Anchor as well, Spotify. Anywhere where you find podcasts, you can find the Prove Me Wrong Podcast. Like and subscribe to the page, and you'll be notified when a brand new episode is released. We typically release an episode once a week, and they run the gambit of topics, so you never really know from week to week what you're going to get. But there are things that excite me and interest me. So go ahead and like and subscribe to the program, and you'll be notified when a new episode is publishes. We're also on Rumble and YouTube, so you can, again, if you're watching the audio version, or if you're listening to the podcast right now and you would actually like to see me live and see me with Chris, we had a Zoom meeting and we talked to each other. You can go on YouTube, you can go on Rumble, and like and subscribe to the page, and you'll be notified again when a brand new episode is released, and you can see the actual video portion. So before we go then tonight, I did want to talk about our sponsor tonight. Our sponsor is ZendoZones. This is my ZendoZone right here at Surf and Stand. ZendoZones are brought to you by JT Eaton. They're citronella burners. They are shaped like fearless bug repellent tiki gods, right? Here's a representation right there. Let Surf and Stand, Hawaiian Howie, and Luau Lily bring the islands to your backyard with ZendoZones citronella burners. They use natural 3% citronella candles and incense cones. They're perfect for patios, decks, backyards, campsites, poolside, and more. You can enjoy the outdoors again. So once again, they are available at Amazon.com and at select Ace Hardware stores. Go ahead and collect them all today. So for my guest tonight, Christopher Hilton, talked about the rise, fall, and rebirth of hair metal. I am Pete Lieb. This is the Prove Me Wrong podcast, and we will see you again soon.